Welcome to this PowerPoint video on lens and scope that will take you through how to identify and assess the particular lens and scope of an argument. Now, I'm calling this a supplementary PowerPoint to the art of argumentation because this was not from thinking skills. This is something very particular to global perspectives, but it is crucial in adding another layer to your evaluation of these articles. So let's begin with lens. Basically, what I mean by lens is the field. This article focuses on one particular field. When you have a complicated issue like, let's say, medical AI and whether or not that's ethical, there's a lot of different ways I can talk about that. Yes, I can mention the ethics. I could go into the technology. I could go into the economic impacts on the medical workforce. I can even talk about politics involved. But it's often difficult for an author to be able to do all of that and provide a comprehensive argument. So typically they're going to focus on one lens, maybe two, maybe three. So it's ideal to then look at the lens and figure out whether or not it's used. So to do that, I want you to first obviously identify the lens. It can be more than one. So even though most of them will focus on just one, so let's say I'm only going to look at the ethical implications of AI in the medical field. I could also touch upon the economics. So maybe I want to do ethical and economics. So once you figure that out, ask yourself, is that lens, is that field an area of expertise for the author? Now, there's many different ways you can determine that. Their degree, their experience, their ability to see. Whatever the case, make sure you always read that top of the paper one where the biographical info is given on the author. Now, if one of the lenses is economic and it turns out the author is a professor of economics, obviously their degree is relevant. But let's say they're a reporter and maybe their degree is in journalism and communications. That doesn't seem to have anything to do with medical AI, but I then read that they are the technological correspondent for the New York Times. So that is their ability to see, that is the experience they have. So always be careful with reporters, journalists. Don't be overly critical. Look at their experience. Then ask yourself the bigger picture, is the lens appropriate for the topic? Is it appropriate to discuss the ethical and economic impacts of AI in the medical field? It definitely seems so. But let's say they brought up the cultural impacts instead. That doesn't seem quite as pressing or urgent as the other fields, so that could be a weakness to the argument. So if you feel that the area of expertise and the appropriateness of the lens are good, then this is obviously a strength. It enhances the argument of the author. If one or both answers are no, then the lens diminishes the argument. Now be careful. It could be that maybe the area is not one of expertise for the author, but the content's very, very strong. That could still be a strong argument. So like in a lot of this PowerPoint and the skills we've been developing, you have to really use your analytical skills and your logic. Next, let's talk about the scope, whether something's global or localized. This can seem really obvious, but there's a lot of elements to it. So ideally, an argument should be global, meaning that throughout the whole paragraphs that I read, they mention countries and regions from different parts of the world, because medical AI may have certain implications in the United Kingdom, but totally different ones in Brazil or South Africa. So it's good to have a wide variety of countries. Now, they could do this with evidence, different studies, different cases from around the world. They could do it with examples of different patients, let's say. It could be experts from around the world, companies that are buying this technology. So there's not one way to do this. Just look for references to different countries and or regions. For those arguments that clearly do have global evidence, examples, cases, whatever, it doesn't stop there. That doesn't automatically make it strong. Because let's say they do mention 3 to 4 different countries, but they're all from the same area. They're all from the Middle East, let's say. Does that mean the argument is then represented for the world? Probably not. Or the one thing I really want you to look out for, do they focus more on developed countries that have more wealth? Obviously, medical AI may be more of an option for them than in some other places. So the issues would be different. And not considering the impacts on the developed world would be a weakness. So even though global scope sounds like a no-brainer, you do have to dig deep in your evaluation to determine if it enhances the MC or if it diminishes. Now, some articles don't have a global scope, they have a localized scope. And you may be quick to write this off as a flaw, but they can be a strength. One big tip I give is to check the title of the article. If the article title specifies a country or region, then you can't fault it for not mentioning other places. So if I look at the title, for example, and it says, the impacts of medical eye in China, benefits versus risk, they're going to focus on China, and maybe they compare it to another country, maybe they don't. That doesn't mean it's flawed. If they give really detailed specifics on different cases, evidence, experts, it's a strength. Now, if it's localized and the evidence, examples, or premises are vague, unspecific, then it would still be a weakness. One of the good things about a localized scope is that it can allow an author to do a deep dive into that particular region and look at many ways that the topic is affecting that country. That can sometimes be better than a global take, because global takes may have to rely more on general comments. So either one, a global scope or a localized scope, can be a strength or weakness depending on how it's supported. So now let's look at examples. This one we've looked at before, and it's about the use of guns in India. Remember my first tip, look at the title, which says Indian celebratory firing kills more, but there's no noise over these gunshots. They clearly only focused on India. So it's safe to assume that the scope is not going to be global, it's going to be localized. So whether or not I deem that to be strong will be determined on the specifics of the cases, examples, evidence, experts, so on. All right, let me see if I can figure out the lens. As I read through it, they specifically focus on weddings. In parts of India, men shoot into the air during weddings, and they connect this to their position in society. And in this last paragraph here, they look at 3 different examples of a waiter, a performer, someone's sister, who were all killed at weddings. So I'm getting the sense that there's a very cultural lens. I keep going, and another lens is brought up when the author says India has strict gun ownership laws in place, and then it gives specifics, such as the fact that they have to complete a license application and submit it to the district police. Okay, that's different from culture. Now they seem to be talking about the legal hurdles and why so many illegal guns are used instead. So now I figured out that the lens is cultural and legal. I ask myself, does that seem appropriate for gun use in India? And it does, because it sets up why there's a problem. The legal system is so strict that a lot of people depend on illegal guns, and it explains the cultural ramifications of why people use guns and how it hurts so many. So that definitely seems like an innovative way to look at the problem that does a deep dive with a lot of specifics. The scope, as I suspected, was not global, it was localized, but because the author gave a lot of specifics, it turns out to enhance the MC. Let's look at another sample. Totally different topic. This is about hosting major sporting events. As I said, look at the title. Hosting major sports events, hidden costs and policy dilemmas. No specific country or region is mentioned, so I'm going to assume it's global. So now I need to be on the lookout for references to different countries and regions, different parts of the world, both developed and developing. And I have to figure out what the lens is. The clue there is costs. So I have an idea, it could be economic. Let me make sure. So as far as the scope, I noticed it mentioned Cape Town, South Africa, Beijing, China, and in this other paragraph, they talk again about Beijing, but also London, Brazil, Sochi. So is it global? Definitely. Does it cover different regions? Yes. Does it consider this issue from both developed and developing countries? Definitely. So it seems like the global scope here is very representative and thus a strength to the argument. If I go back to the things that I blocked off, I want to make sure if the lens is economic. They're talking about how stadiums that are built are then not used again. They become tourist attractions, but they don't really generate money. And then very specifically, the author gives us the costs for all the different Olympics in the different parts of the world. 43 billion in Beijing, 17.25 billion in London, 11 billion for Brazil, 52.5 billion for Sochi. So the lens, like I suspected, is clearly economic. But now that I've identified it, I assess it. Does this seem appropriate for the topic? It definitely does, because the cost of these make many people debate whether or not they're worth it. And with the global scope, it makes sense because now they can see the ramifications in different parts of the world, especially since they consider developed and developing. 17.25 billion for London was huge, but 52.5 for Sochi, which is having an economic downturn, is even worse. Or for Brazil, which then experienced a horrible recession after the World Cup, it really shows how these sporting events can be detrimental to the host nations. So overall, the economic lens and the global scope of this argument make it very compelling. And this is how I need you to consider lens and scope as yet one more thing to evaluate when you're looking at paper 1s and when you're doing your own research for paper 2. Thank you.